Okay, welcome everyone. Shavua Tov. It's Sunday. We have to start preparing for Passover. We're studying the laws of Passover. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about gluten allergies, celiac, and the 5 species of grain from Torah law, as well as the theological and philosophical implications of those things. And just some overview of information. So we're opened up to chapter 5, and the Rambam says, Ein asur mishum chametz bepesach el chamesha dagan bilvad. So only the 5 species of grain that the Torah mentions creates chametz. If you take some other thing and make flour or something, some kind of flour out of it, for example, rice is not one of the 5 species. Now we'll get Ashkenazim. For Ashkenazim, it's kitniot, etc., and there are more laws to be said about that. But there's no karet involved. There's no spiritual punishment of spiritual excision. So let's just talk at the basic level. At the basic level, the level, there are 5 species of grain. And by the way, kitniot is a much, much later rabbinic enactment. It doesn't even come from a Sanhedrin. It doesn't come from a Jewish Supreme Court. So there actually is a lot of leeway. Well, I'm not a posek, so let's not get into that. Let's just talk basic halacha, theology, and theological and philosophical implications. So there's 5 species of grain. So if you take one that is not one of the 5 species, for example, rice, and you create a flour out of it, the Torah realizes that there's different chemical processes. And one process we call that chametz, and another process we call that sirchon, masriach. So the Rambam explains, what are these 5 species? V'hein shni mine hachitin. There's 2 species of wheat, which is the wheat species. And by the way, it's fascinating because evolutionarily, the Torah gets this right. The Rambam knows this based upon the Mishnah. The Mishnah knows this based upon the Torah Shebaal Peh. The Torah Shebaal Peh is connected to Torah Shebichtav. And the separation of these species is actually correct from an evolutionary perspective. Right? So, chitim is wheat, kusemet is rye, I believe. Ushloshet mina has sa'orin. There's 3 species of barley. Shehena sa'ora, which is barley. Shibolet shu'al, which it's a big modern day machloket, the identity of Shibolet Shu'al. But for now, we'll just call it oats. And the last one is chiffon, spelt. So we have wheat, rye, barley, oats, and spelts. And those are the 5 species of grain that if you mix them with water and let them sit, if you make a flour, mix them with water and let them sit, or even not making the flour, just mixing them with water and let them sit long enough, they will chametzify themselves. They will be machmitz themselves. Now, if you take something that's not one of the 5 species, for example, rice, and you create a flour out of it, and then you mix it with water, and the Rambam goes on to explain, and you put it with clothing, it might rise, but that's called sirchon. So the Torah recognizes that there's something called chametz. It's a fascinating, we could talk anthropologically a little bit, but for another time. But it's a fascinating history of human beings and creating bread, or what we call chametz. Now, it's interesting because it is possible to make the argument that the common denominator between all the 5 species of grain is the gluten aspect, is that high level of gluten that exists in these 5 species. But the odd man out would be oats, because oats has such a low level of gluten, and even the gluten that it has is only from cross-contamination during the growing process from other species of gluten grains. So, based upon this, there are even some modern rabbis who hold that we have the identity of Shibolet Shu'al wrong. That oats cannot be Shibolet Shu'al. it's impossible that oats can be shul. And how do we know? Because it doesn't give you that gluten kick that the other ones give you. I'm simplifying a very technical dispute right now, but that is the simplification, just so we can get our minds into the door of this great conversation and great debate. And so there are a lot of quote unquote gluten-free or gluten low-level breads that are made nowadays out of oat flour. And the question is, if oats is not one of the 5 species, then it can't make matzah. The same 5 species that create chametz are the same 5 species, are the only 5 species that one can use in order to make matzah. One more time. The same 5 species that would create chametz are the same 5 species that you have to use in order to create matzah. So the modern poskim, the modern halachic decisors, decide that you should not use oats for the Passover Seder matzah. You should not use oat matzah. The reason why you should not do oat matzah is because modern day poskim argue over whether oats is one of the 5 species. Wheat matzah, barley matzah, spelt matzah, but stay away from oat matzah. So all the matzah we buy in the stores is wheat matzah. And so therefore, for sure, according to all opinions, we're fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah on the Seder night. And there's also a different type of kiyum mitzvah for all the successive 7 days of Passover that you have to eat matzah every single day. But the most important is to eat matzah on the night of the Seder. Eating matzah on the night of the Seder, enough amount of matzah, real, true, biblical matzah, according to halacha, fulfills a mitzvah deoraita. And then there's a kiyum type of mitzvah, a fulfillatory mitzvah, that if you're going to make a motzi, you have to eat matzah, because it's forbidden to eat to bread anyways, during the 7 days, successive days of Passover. So that is the machloket behind the shibul shu'al, the identity of oats. Is oats one of the 5 species or not? And additionally, the Torah's understanding of the chemical processes. The Torah in the ancient world realized that there's certain things that really create that bread kick, that yeasty, fermenty, whatever you want to call it, that gluten experience in the mouth, that we know and love to be chametz. And there's 5 species. And the Torah begs it out, the 4 species. The 5th one, oats, is machloket whether or not that is truly one of the 5 species. And the nafkamina, the practical halachic ramification, would be either is it considered chametz if it mixes with water and sits for long enough, and also, could you even make matzah out of it to fulfill your mitzvah of the Passover Seder? Okay, now let's get to the question of celiacs and gluten allergies. So, it seems to be certain, right, that if somebody's a celiac, and eating matzah would be dangerous for that person, I have to check, but I think there's a very strong argument that the person will be exempt from the mitzvah of eating matzah. Exempt from the mitzvah of eating matzah. Because, the Gemara talks about this all the time, right? How do we know that the lulav is not the branch with the thorns in it? Because darchei noam, the Torah is pleasant. The Torah would never require you to do a positive mitzvah that would bring you physical pain. The Torah says the same thing about women in Puravu. How do we know that women are not chayiv in Puravu? Because the Torah would never require you to do something that would cause you physical pain. Darchei noam. Therefore, the mitzvah of Puravu is on the man. The woman does the mitzvah, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your fellow Jew, to her husband, when she helps him fulfill this mitzvah of Puravu. But she herself doesn't have mitzvah of Puravu. And then there's the whole question of marriage itself. Is marriage in order to do Puravu, or is marriage a separate mitzvah in and of itself? So for someone who's a celiac, it's a very big argument to make, and I have to check this, but I think that if the gluten in the 5 species, even if you made matzah, it would still be there. wouldn't develop as much, but it's still there, it would wreck for silek, then that would be a problem. Maybe silek's not chayiv in matzah. But the question is, what about oat matzah? Should they eat oat matzah on the Passover Seder? Because oat matzah, either no gluten or low gluten, I'm not really sure, but there is a possibility that oat matzah could actually be a viable option from a medical standpoint. The question, though, is oat matzah even fulfill the mitzvah of matzah on Passover? Probably not. Rosh Hashanah Zalman Auerbach was very strong. He said that oat matzah is one of the 5 species, and oats are one of the 5 species, and therefore it can make matzah and it can make chametz. And so therefore, if you're a Jew who has no gluten allergies, and we're going to be discussing, I don't even understand really what gluten allergies are, but if you fall into the category that you don't have problems with gluten, right, then you fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on the Seder night with wheat matzah, because wheat matzah is definitely, or one of the other 4. That's not the debatable one, because wheat matzah is definitely fulfills your mitzvah of deoraita, your biblical mitzvah to eat matzah on the Passover night. So then, if you're celiac and gluten and oat matzah would be a viable option, then perhaps you can use oat matzah. But I, who have no problem with gluten, would never use oat matzah because I don't know whether I have a suffix. There are some poskim who say oats is one of the 5 species, and some poskim who say oats is not one of the 5 species. Right? Is oats shibul shu'al? I don't know. I'm sitting here. I'm not able to understand. I just know that some poskim say this way, some say this. So therefore, I would never use it. I would never ever use it. So that's how the cookie crumbles to do the joke there. But that's the basic introduction to the laws of Passover, and the takeaway is how amazing is our Torah to understand the 5 species, what they are, understand their evolutionary backgrounds by separating them into 2 categories that actually match up to what our understanding of the phylogeny, the genetic phylogeny of these species is. It's truly amazing. And then finally, we had a dispute about the identity of Shibal Shual. Is it oats or is it not? Is oats one of the 5 species or is it not? And as well, we discussed the idea that rice flour mixed with water is called sirchon. It's not called chimutz. It's not called creating chametz. It's called smellification or whatever. Smelling. I made up a word, obviously, smellification, but that's the whole point of the rice. And if you made some kind of loaf of bread out of rice flour, that would not be chametz, midoraita. Ashkenazim don't eat kitniot, so they can't have rice anyways. But there's a lot of debate going on in the world right now, whether or not people could be makel on kitniot. Let's say you go to Sephardi's house on Passover, and you're an Ashkenazi. What can you do? Anyways, have a wonderful rest of the time before Passover comes, the rest of the week, Shabbos. We have to study the laws and prepare for Passover, and we will all have a Yetziat Misraim in our own way. Begashmius and Beruchtius. I'll see you guys all on the next time.